I now want to take you back to turn of the century Vienna, where we will revisit the Dora case and relate it to the idea of the social construction of trauma. Because primarily I was invited here to speak with you fellows in history, I do want to just say briefly that the sources for this lecture are many. They include my study of Freud, in this instance particularly my study of the Dora case, and a follow-up to the Dora case many years later in a psychoanalytic journal. I also study films about war, both documentaries and docudramas, and war poetry, and I'm particularly interested in the poetry of Wilfred Owen. I'm interested in war memoirs, such as Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. There are other sources that contribute to my thinking about this lecture, my studies of war, of violence, of trauma, and my own research into the Holocaust. There are other sources which I will be happy to discuss with any fellow who might be interested in knowing it. So let's now go to Vienna at the turn of the century. It had undergone a sexual revolution. There was a very, very public encounter with sexuality. But this existed side by side with an ongoing embrace of conservatism, of social conservatism of all kinds, and with ideas about women which included the following. They were sexually unaware, they were sexually ignorant, they were frightened by sex, they were disinterested, they were frigid, they had no desire, they had no sexual agency. They were incapable of saying yes or no. I do want to add that this coexisted with a really alarming statistic. Just a couple of decades before the turn of the century, medical estimates of the prevalence of syphilis among German men was that at least 80% of them were infected. This would suggest that large percentages of the female gender were infected as well. But in certain circles in Vienna, sex was denied as a particularly important issue. Now, Freud was focused on sex at the beginning of his explorations about neurosis. He asserted that hysteria, a neurotic illness, was the result of actual seductions in childhood of small children by their parents, by other members of their family, and family friends. And he asserted that these experiences, so traumatic, were repressed, were forced into the unconscious, where they were not available as memories to these seduced victims. And side by side with these assertions of sexual license permeating Viennese society, the people of Vienna encountered the work of Gustav Klimt. Now, in fact, Gustav Klimt led a major art movement in Vienna at the exact same time as Freud treated Dora, formulated her case, and eventually wrote about it. That period of time was almost a decade from the time he first treated her to the time the case report was published. And during that same period of time, Klimt led the Secession Movement, a major art movement in Vienna, a very radically designed building, the Secession building, was constructed. And Klimt received commissions for work on the ceiling at the University of Vienna. So he had his following, he was admired, even as he produced more than 10 children, it is reported, with many different women. So again, sex exploded on the Viennese scene, even as the more conservative elements of Viennese society asserted that Klimt's work was pornographic. Now I want to show you a sample of Klimt's sexually explicit work. In this first slide, we see a naked man and woman bowing down before the forces of sexual goddesses. In this one, we see naked women in very provocative poses. These are all part of Klimt's public murals. This one I find to be particularly evocative, for obvious reasons. And the next one shows a woman who seems to be masturbating. All public art. Here we have a picture of a naked woman, and yet another. And to my eyes, Klimt was representing women as passionately and confidently sexual, as knowing what they did and did not want. Now, I have one more Klimt slide to show, and I want to preface that with a comment about the vernacular. When we say we have someone wrapped around our little finger, we mean we really have control over that person. Now, in the next piece of art by Klimt that I want to show you, we have the woman with the snake, the purveyor of original sin in the Old Testament, wrapped around her arm. She's a snake charmer. The snake is not strangling her. Now, I could, of course, discuss the psychoanalytic metaphor of the phallic snake, but we really don't even have to go there. But Freud was no Klimt. Freud was always very fearful of social disapprobation. Now, we know why. Freud was a Jew in anti-Semitic Vienna. As a small boy, he had had experiences in which he and his father were out walking, and his father was humiliated by an anti-Semite. His father did not stand up to the man. This was something that Freud carried with him for the rest of his life. Freud also found himself blocked in his efforts to get a professorship, all because of anti-Semitism. So he was very concerned with acceptance by middle-class and upper-middle-class Vienna, both Jews and non-Jews, but primarily by the dominant culture of the Christians. So he abandoned his assertion that neurosis was caused by actual sexual abuse, by actual sexual trauma. He had to do this because it was an assault on the sensibility of the middle and upper class, and they disapproved of him for saying such things. The other thing you have to understand about Freud is that he was consistently in search of a way of understanding the world which gave him a sense of mastery, of control of his destiny, of agency, really of impenetrability to criticism. So abandoning the theory of causation involving actual sexual abuse gave him that sense of security, of being acceptable within Viennese society. And curiously, Freud never explained why he abandoned the seduction theory and moved to the theory that we can refer to as infantile sexual fantasy. Never explained why he changed his mind. Freud waited 5 years to publish his report of his brief analysis with Dora. He diagnosed her as an hysteric, a condition which caused physical symptoms because of those repressed, incestuous desires of early childhood, the Oedipus Complex. I probably don't need to spell that out, but the essence of it is the 4-year-old child wants to kill the parent of the same sex and be with, marry, make love to, make babies with the parent of the opposite sex. That fantasy is repressed. It returns in the form of the physical symptoms of hysteria. As regards Dora, Freud knew that she had had a kind of flirtatious encounter with a family friend, Herr K. And he asserted, Freud did, that she abruptly left her analysis with him, which she did with almost no warning after a very short period of time, because she was jealous that Herr K had ceased paying any attention to her and was angry at him and transferred that anger from Herr K onto Freud, thus leaving him in the analysis. Freud emphasized the discovery of transference. This was actually an important discovery, that people in analysis will transfer ideas, thoughts, feelings from one person onto another. But really, in many ways, this was, in fact, incidental to what was going on with Dora. But Freud focused on transference, made that the focal point of his write-up of the case, and of course won kudos from his followers. Dora became the case where he discovered transference. Now, he did take responsibility for not recognizing Dora's transference, but he ignored a radically different formulation of Dora's life experience. That she had been sexually abused by both her father and Herr K, that she had been reluctant to tell Freud that she had been seduced and raped by them. She did touch lightly on this with Freud, and finding him unresponsive, she left analysis abruptly. To my mind, as a clinician, this is not a matter of transference, it is a matter of poor treatment by the analyst. Now, I do want to say something. I am not Freud bashing here. I was trained as a Freudian analyst. I still consider myself a person who understands Freud and finds his genius valuable in my work. The fact is, I do believe, in this case, Freud missed the boat. Now, you fellows have read the Dora case, so I need to say something about how I, as a clinically trained analyst, read Freud and understand Freud. Because I don't read him the way I would if I were doing archival history. At least I don't think I would, since I don't really do archival history. Maybe I'm wrong. Freud had defined a way that the analyzed analyst listens to the patient. Freud required all of the people who were becoming analysts to be analyzed. And he believed that they learned to listen to what the patient was saying, to the free associations of the patient, in a very particular way. Eventually, it became known as evenly hovering attention. The analyst would go into an altered state of consciousness, an altered state of mind, a reverie. And as the analyst listened to the words of the patient flow over her or his consciousness, words would sometimes strike the analyst as being important. The analyst would have internal associations in her or his mind, and the analyst would then generate psychoanalytic hypotheses. Now, Freud also described, using a radio metaphor, the way the analyst's mind and the mind of the patient were in sync. And there was a communication, a mysterious kind of communication, unconscious to unconscious, evenly hovering attention and reverie in use. There's another way I read Freud, and that is a way that you're familiar with. I call it participant observation. And here I want to emphasize the value of interdisciplinary research, because two of my colleagues here at the university, Pauline Strong in anthropology and Tom Palaima in classics, are people with whom I have worked who have illustrated to me very, very vividly how critical it is to place oneself in the time and place of the object or subject of study, of recognizing that you can't simply observe at a distance, that you have to observe from the inside. So when Tom Palaima and I co-teach a course on war and violence, and Tom reads a text from the ancient world, the way I observe him, he's back there in time. He's thinking like a Greek. He's thinking like a Roman. He is a participant observer. And since he's here in the audience, if he thinks I'm not telling the truth, I'm sure he will speak up during the question and answer period. Now, medicine pays lip service to the importance of participant observation, cultural sensitivity. But the fact of the matter is, physicians are focused on diagnosis and treatment, focused on guidelines, focused on technology, and they are not culturally aware. Just yesterday, in the Austin American-Statesman, there was a report of research done here in Texas in which the attitudes of doctors towards clinical material was described. Doctors are sure they're always right. Even when they're only right 5% of the time, 65% of the time, they're sure they're right. They don't think they're right, they're sure they're right. If you say to them, would you like a consultation and a second opinion? They will say, no, I don't need it, I'm right. So the idea of incorporating participant observation, humility, an awareness of really not understanding what you're hearing and the need to listen very, very carefully and self-critically is something that medicine is not very good at. I'm trying to learn. I don't think Freud learned very well. So I employ reverie, freely hovering attention, and participant observation when I read Freud, when I reread the Dora case. And I want to tell you, I reread the Dora case not with the expectation of the shape and direction this lecture would take. I reread the Dora case because it was a case within my field that people talk about when they talk about trauma. And I was shocked by what I learned. Now I'm going to give you another version of what I got out of Freud's description of Dora. I can only summarize it here, but I am available. If any of you fellows or anybody else wants to go over that case with me, line by line, I am very happy to show you how I drew the conclusions I drew. But this is my reading, my rereading of the Dora case. She came from a severely dysfunctional family. She had experienced incest at the hands of her father. She had contracted syphilis from him by having oral sex with him. Father and Herr K. seduced her, groomed her, and raped her repeatedly. Now, I do not mean here that this was rape at gunpoint, rape at knife point, rape with the threat of a violent beating. But it was rape in the sense that many groomed, sexually seduced children are repeatedly raped. Dora's father had a long-standing affair with Herr K's wife. Dora's father gave Dora to Herr K to facilitate that relationship. Freud disbelieved Dora as an accurate reporter. She couldn't be a sentient woman. She couldn't know what she was talking about. She couldn't know anything about sex. She couldn't know what she wanted. She couldn't know what she did want. It was easy to conclude, hey, Herr K had flirted with her. She was a young girl. She fell in love with Herr K. Herr K didn't come through. She was angry. She got into treatment with Freud. The anger, by the way, related to anger at her father, dating back to repressed Oedipal fantasies, anger at her father for not leaving her mother for her. She developed hysteria. She had this transference reaction. That was the story. She was not a victim of actual sexual abuse. Another symptom she had was aphonia. Aphonia is when you can't speak. This is a very common symptom in traumatized people. In World War I, one of the most common forms of shell shock was aphonia. Soldiers literally could not speak. Freud did not recognize the aphonia for what it was. So again, Freud did not recognize that Dora attempted to tell him what actually happened. Did not take into account that she was inhibited by Viennese culture, which she knew made her story less believable. The subsequent report on Dora's health, something that I can read again because I have read a lot of medical records, suggests that she had multiple venereal diseases, that they were chronic, that they were largely non-progressive, and they were never identified as such in the medical record. So, Dora is diagnosed as an hysteric. She is not diagnosed as the victim of trauma. Her leaving analysis is not appreciated for what it is, but the analyst was, in her eyes, incompetent. And she was angry at him, no doubt. I think it's clear that Freud's diagnosis of Dora and his formulation of her case was a social construction. Now I want to move on to war, which Freud only reluctantly studied. Freud had a real inhibition about looking at war. And I believe that this is consistent with Freud's difficulty considering what he could not control. Because in fact, Freud had 3 sons in uniform during World War I. And he knew very well what dangers they faced. One of his sons was sending him letters in which he would say, "Bullets pass through my cap every day." Freud had nightmares, and Freud would assert, by the way, when asked, that he had no idea what combatants experienced. He could comment on what civilians experienced on the home front, but had no idea what combatants experienced. He had nightmares about his sons in combat. But rather than acknowledge that these were traumatic dreams, that they reflected his fear of their mutilations, of their deaths, he asserted, which, and this I find so preposterous, and also preposterous that, to my knowledge, no colleague has ever commented on it. He asserted that his nightmares reflected envy of the youth of his sons. Wasn't it wonderful that they were in danger of being killed in combat? They were so young, and he envied them. That's why he had the nightmares. I suggest, again, he was dealing with trauma which he could not control. Freud expressed inability to contribute anything of value to the study of war in a very famous exchange of letters with Albert Einstein, many decades after World War I. His inability to think about war right after World War I is something that is not well known and is actually reflected in the following 4 documents, which I discovered when I was doing interdisciplinary work at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Right after the war, the Carnegie Endowment attempted to bring together the smartest people in the world to write about war in the hopes that it could be prevented. Freud signed a contract to do this, and within 2 months, I think, perhaps 3, of signing the contract, he backed out. He said he could not make a contribution. This is the letter from the functionary, Pauline Stearns, stating that Freud had abrogated the contract, and this is the contract. And I must say, I think you'll even be able to see his signature there. So this is a document that, curiously enough, I have been trying to get published for about 10 years. And there's a story to be told about that too, but I'll leave that for another time. I think Freud's inability to deal with trauma inhibited the development of a well-studied psychology, psychotherapy, and sociology of trauma until very recent decades. But I suggest, more importantly, there's an important lesson here. Trauma is a great leveler. It reminds us all that we are all vulnerable. This always makes it hard to study. It makes it hard to study today. And it contributes to it being socially constructed. I want to call your attention to the work of Facine and Reckman, The Empire of Trauma. I did ask the fellows to read 3 chapters of that. I really recommend that you read it all. It's a very, very fine study underscoring the subjectivity, the socially constructed nature of trauma. It's a very, very fine piece of work. Now, I want to say thank you to another colleague of mine who is here today, Karen Engel, with whom I teach in the law school. We teach a course, War, Trauma, and Law. And working with Karen has stimulated me to focus on the subjectivity of trauma. And what follows now reflects the influence of our work together. Now, if she wants to disavow that, she can also do that during the Q&A. So I'm going to pose 3 provocative sets of questions, but first I want to state a few assumptions, because I don't want to be misunderstood. There is definitely such a thing as trauma, and we know it when we can see it. But the can is important. I wanted the fellows to read Tim O'Brien because I think it's important to understand that I know there is such a thing as trauma. Psychiatric diagnosis, second assumption, psychiatric diagnosis as it now exists is always socially constructed. Tom Sass taught us that about the most severe mental illnesses. Third assumption, trauma destroys lives. It leads to chronic severe mental pain, depression, and suicide. We are seeing an epidemic of suicide among war veterans. That is the result of trauma. Fourth assumption, we don't understand why some people are more resilient than others. That's something to be studied. Fifth assumption, war is always atrocious and potentially traumatic for everyone involved, including combatants and civilians. Next assumption, killing people is usually atrocious and traumatic. I actually think there are some exceptions to that, but really far fewer than you might think. Rape. Rape is an atrocious weapon of war. There is no question in my mind that it is just that. Torture, dehumanization, humiliation, natural disasters, catastrophes are traumatic. Now, this is only a partial list of assumptions, but I hope I have made it very clear that I am not suggesting that trauma is imaginary. Now to my first set of provocative questions. In Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, we encounter Maria, a young girl, really not a grown woman. As a civilian, a victim, she has witnessed the assassination of her parents, and she has been raped. How do we understand her development through the story? Does she remain a civilian? Does her personal experience of her rape change? Does she become a combatant who bears a wound of war? Does that make her feel less traumatized? Maybe even heroic? I'm not offering answers. I want you to think about the questions. That's part of your job for the year. Now here's my second set of questions. Is it possible that in civil guerrilla warfare, when it may be hard, if not impossible, to define who is a combatant, what we usually think of as atrocious and traumatizing behavior between combatants who are not in uniform is experienced by many of them as expected acts and experiences of war? Might some of them feel that either commission of such acts or being on their receiving end is not traumatic? Might the experience of what is traumatic be a response to a labeling process, which occurs when outsiders redefine what has happened during a war? And those outsiders could be members of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They could be humanitarian workers. Many, many kinds of outsiders. Now my third set of questions. I want to take you back to the Iliad, to Achilles and Patroclus, who were raised as brothers. They were brothers in arms. They were probably lovers. Achilles felt responsible for Patroclus's death in combat. And he was traumatized and showed it temporarily after Patroclus was killed. Yet, extrapolating from the Iliad and going back to ancient Athens, there seems to be no evidence of epidemics of chronic PTSD in ancient Athens. No epidemics of suicide, though war was a way of life. And when the Athenians went to war, they were barbarians. They threw babies off parapets. They raped women. They had the belief, an Athenian man had the belief that if he killed your husband, you, the widow, would really prefer to be with him in the future because you were stronger than her husband. And yet, in spite of all that, no epidemics of PTSD. But there was one difference between that culture and ours. The entire polis, the entire body politic, assumed responsibility for acts of war and participated in rituals, cleansing rituals, healing rituals after warfare. So, questions. Is trauma healed then when communities assume responsibility for what are otherwise assigned roles in the history of traumatic interactions? Roles as perpetrators or victims? Does communalization of responsibility heal those who report traumatic reactions after wars? Does communalization of trauma heal those who report trauma after periods of repression and even torture, such as in the history of apartheid in South Africa? And if communalization does not completely heal, does it aid in healing? Now, I want to call to your attention the invitation I received to give this inaugural lecture for the 2013-14 Institute for Historical Studies. You are being asked to study the relationship of trauma and social transformation. This is a very complex relationship. If you believe, based on this lecture, that even in part, trauma is socially constructed, what we have here is trauma and society. And they are in a dynamic, bipolar, influential process. Trauma affects society. Society is transformed. It, in turn, affects trauma, and we get a feedback loop. So you historians have a very tall order in trying to define this relationship this year. And I thought I had a very tall order when they asked me to give this lecture. And I want to tell you what they asked me to do, and then I'll apologize for not doing it. They said, review the history of trauma in psychotherapy, explain the physical and psychological origins and consequences of trauma, and reflect on the challenges of the humanities and historians in particular in integrating trauma into our understanding of the human condition. In short, we are thinking of a general lecture along the lines of what are we talking about when we talk about trauma. So I do apologize. Now, I realize that I could have said a lot more about the history of the psychotherapy of trauma, though I hope I can explain that because of Freud's reluctance to deal with trauma, there are limitations to what has been discovered. And psychotherapy has less to offer than might have otherwise been the case. I do hope I conveyed the promise of what a community approach to trauma might offer. I also realize that I have ignored a discussion of the physical consequences of trauma and only walked you around the edges of its psychological causes, its origin. Now, I want to stress that I have focused on what I see as the important and potential contribution of history to understanding trauma and its role in both mandating and facilitating social transformation. You historians have the opportunity to help us all better understand the social construction of trauma. You historians can help those of us in the mental health disciplines better understand ourselves and how we have participated in defining trauma, influenced as we are by societal pressures and the constraints of our traditional treatment modalities. You historians can take a fresh look at the history of trauma, of violence, catastrophic events, and the way all of these have created conceptualizations of trauma, treatments of trauma, efforts at remediation of trauma. Now, I'm getting on in years. I'm almost midway through my 74th year, and I've grown to telling people that I have a life's work. I didn't make that up. Someone here on campus said that about me, but I liked it, so I repeated it. And it is to convince everyone who might be interested and involved that psychoanalysis should be a department, a separate department in the research university. It made a fatal error when it joined itself with medicine in the United States. There are reasons for that. It also had to do with the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. But it was a fatal error. It's not exclusively a subspecialty of psychiatry and psychology. It's not exclusively a branch of medicine. I actually feel that as a clinical psychoanalyst, and I'm not talking now about a Freud scholar who teaches in the English department or the history department. I'm a trained clinician. I've got an MD degree, trained in psychiatry, I'm trained in psychoanalysis as a subspecialty. But I believe that I am equally a healer and a humanities scholar. And I don't mean to sound presumptuous when I say that. And I guess after this lecture you can decide whether You can lay claim to that or not. And I certainly think that, that psychoanalysis can be a catalyst for bringing different disciplines together in research at a research university. And at this university, with its emerging medical school, it can be a catalyst for uniting the medical school intellectually in a very dynamic way with the rest of the university. So, since that's what I want to convince you all of, I think you can understand why I chose to give the lecture that I gave. I really have welcomed this opportunity to speak with all of you today, and I hope that I've been constructive in my effort to set you on a productive course for your collective efforts this year.